Welcome back to Thoughts from a Bookworm. I'm Abigail Grace. Today we are going to be talking about the first official book in the series, The Lunar Chronicles. Cinder is one of my all-time favorite books, and it is one of those books that is so well written, it's like mind-blowing. There have been a handful of books that I have read where I can tell that the author isn't necessarily a ultra talented writer, and he or she makes up for it in, super elegant speeches or, super heavy metaphors or backgrounds or world building or this and that. Marissa Meyer, and I mean this is a genuine compliment, Marissa Meyer is just so simple and straightforward. Her books are fun to read. I want to go back to them. They're easy to understand. They're easy to digest and swallow and visualize in your head. It's just such a good, well-written book, and I love it so much. Even if you don't like science fiction or you aren't a fan of the Lunar Chronicles or it doesn't really sound like your vibe, I would implore everyone to at least read this book one time because it really is just such a well-written book. I remember the first time I read it, I was so shocked at how good it was. I know that sounds so stupid. I just feel like reading good literature is so rare today, and I don't know if that makes me snob, and I know that is just one person's opinion, but I feel like reading good, well-written books is a rare find today. And I know Cinder was written, I think in 2012, so it's 12 years old, so it was written a while ago, but it's just such a good book. The pacing of it is good. It is mostly story. There's not a ton of action in it, which I'm fine with, even for a science fiction book. I actually really enjoyed the story, and there were very mild action, semi-action stuff, things that happen that keep you interested, keep you hooked, continue to keep the ball rolling of the story. It's just such a good book. It was paced so well. It hooked me from the very beginning. I read the first chapter and I was like, oh my gosh, I want to be a cyborg for Halloween. That was the first thing that my mind went to when I read it. I was like, this is cool. This girl is really cool. One thing that was kind of made me chuckle is when I first read it, I didn't know that Cinder was a cyborg. So when I read it and it's oh, she's a cyborg, I was equating that. I didn't really know what a cyborg was. I thought that a cyborg was a humanized robot. So I'm like, okay, wait a second. If we're having a romance with a robot, and then when we met Kai and he was a human, I was like, if we're having a romance with a robot and a human, I'm not doing that. And then it, very quickly we're told that no, she's a human. She has, cyborg. What does Addie call them? Eccentricities? I don't know. She calls them something, but she's a human. She's a cyborg. I do think it was interesting that Cinder refers to Audrey as her stepmom when she's not her stepmom. She's her foster mom, her host mom, her adopted mom. I thought it was a little odd, and I know it was kind of, the Cinderella tie-in, stepmom, wicked stepmom, but she wasn't really her stepmom, so that was the one thing that I didn't really like about this was just, she wasn't really her stepmom, because Garen wasn't her biological, this and that. I liked that we had the two stepsisters, the younger one who's the nicer one, which kind of reminded me of Ever After with Drew Barrymore. We had the younger stepsister, it was Danielle, Marguerite, Jacqueline. We had the younger, kind of nicer stepsister who's in her older sister's shadow, so she's kind of by default the nicer one. I love the relationship that Cinder and Peony have. It's just very sweet, very cute. I was so sad when Peony died. And it's so irritating too, because if you think about it, Kai gave Cinder the antidote, and she talked for 10 minutes with Dr. Erland after the fact. If she would have taken the antidote and run to the quarantines, she would have saved Peony. It's just so sad to me that Peony died. I did not at all peg Cinder as being Celine, but usually I'm pretty good at picking stuff up like that. It's oh, there's a mention of a lost princess. Cinder can't remember her background. I'm like, oh, I wonder who the lost princess is. I did not pick that up. Again, the brilliance of Marissa Meyer just threw in little hints. Oh yeah, there's a lost princess. Oh yeah, this. And it just right over my head. Didn't get it. That last page, when Dr. Erland was like, oh yeah, by the way, Lavana's your aunt, my jaw hit the floor. That, seriously, I cannot rave about this book enough. It was just so good. It had me so hooked from the beginning, it was absolutely brilliant. I loved Kai. I low-key, not even low-key, I high-key have a thing for Asian men. And I kind of like always have. Like, Asian men just hit different. And so when we got Kai, Prince Kai, who is Asian and who is hot and who is just this adorable little cinnamon roll, like, it just like made me so happy. I know he's fictional. One little Easter egg that we get in Cinder is Dr. Erlon's name drop of his crescent moon, which again, I didn't pick that up. I mean, I read it, but I didn't pick up on that the first time I read it. It was like, oh, okay, his daughter died, bummer. And then jumping into Cress, I didn't register, like, oh my gosh, that's the kid that Dr. Erlon. I did not pick that up, but that was really cool. Reading through it a second time, again, you can just see the mapping out that Marissa Meyer did. She mapped this whole series out, and it was beautiful. It was amazing. One thing that was a little bit confusing when we met Levana in Cinder for the first time, it's implied that you can resist the glamoring that the Lunars do, because Torin told Kai, like, you did really well. Kai, like, you know, was like jamming his fingernails into his palm when he met her to like snap himself out of this, you know, glamorized whatever. But then as the series goes on, it's like, no, you can't fight glamour. You're forced into it. And then we're showed that in Ferris, Levana literally forced Everett to marry her. So there's somewhat of an inconsistency where that goes as far as, you know, the glamorizing. Is it just in your head and you can fight it if you're super, super strong? Or is it like, no, you can't, like, you're literally under their control? I think it's the latter. I'm not entirely sure, but we're given just a little bit of that. I loved the dinner scene with Kai and Levana. That was one of those scenes where it wasn't necessary for the plot. Like, you could take that whole section out or skip it and not miss any vital information. But at the same time, it provides a lot of information about Kai and his character and just reinforces the wickedness of Levana. Because at that point, if you haven't read Ferris first, which I would not recommend reading Ferris first if you've never read the series. Obviously, if you're here, you have read the series, so I'm kind of talking to a wall. If you haven't read Ferris first, we're not really shown the wickedness of Levana. We're just told about it. So to get this scene, this very minor, very relatively short scene of Levana staging this event just to potentially kill this servant or manipulate Kai was great. And like I said, it's one of those scenes where it's not critical to the plot. It's just super helpful and reinforces Levana's wickedness, the world that they're in, all that kind of stuff. One of my favorite quotes from the book is back at the beginning when Cinder is, I think it's the first line that Cinder has when she says it's not like wires are contagious. I love Cinder's sass. I love how she goes up to her stepmother's, her foster mom's apartment when both of, you know, Peony and Pearl are being fitted for their gowns, and Cinder's like, oh yeah, let me just go change my clothes and I'll be down. And they kind of all freeze. Like, she's just so sarcastic and like passive aggressive, but kind of in a good way. Like, Adri needed to be rattled a little bit and like reminded, hey, you have a third kid, you know, living with you. Don't ignore her. And then of course the magic pumpkin. I mean, we can't forget about the magic pumpkin. My dream car, well, okay, I have a lot of dream cars. One of my dream cars is an old 56 Volkswagen Beetle. I want it in the color yellow. But Cinder's was orange because it was a pumpkin. I think Peony even makes a reference to, oh, it's an ugly pumpkin color or something like that. And that's Cinder's getaway car. At the end, when she's going to the palace or leaving? No, she's going to the palace in the car. She hits it. It smashes, which again, you know, the pumpkin in Cinderella tumbles over, smashes. Again, it's just, I love the subtle nuances of the original fairy tale to these. And I know these books are marketed as fairy tale retellings, and I honestly feel like that's a very poor description for them. Because yes, there is fairy tale inspiration, but the world building, the story itself, the tie-ins, it's just so good. It's not really a fairy tale retelling. The fairy tale retelling elements in it are so minor. Like in Cinder, her name is Cinder. Cinderella Cinder. Okay, we have a prince. We have a stepmom. We have a ball. and we have a pumpkin. So we've got 5 points. I don't think that's enough to encapsulate the entire story of Cinder as, oh yeah, it's a fairy tale retelling of Cinderella. So I think that's somewhat of an unfair description when people say, oh, it's a Lunar Chronicles about, oh, it's a fairy tale retelling, you know, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel. Because it's like, not really. It's not really a Cinderella story. It's a story that has very subtle, like, hints or flavors of Cinderella, which again, I think is great because it's like the author came up with something new and different and exciting and was able to put a twist on it and make it somewhat familiar. Like, oh, okay, I kind of already knew, okay, the series is going to end happy because they're fairy tale retellings. Everybody gets their happily ever after, which is good because that's one of my biggest book pet peeves is when books don't end happy. Like, they don't have to end with like singing and dancing and this and that, but like there needs to be something that makes me want to come back to it. And this series, I finished this series and started again because it was just so good, and just the characters that we meet, I just absolutely love this book. And the cliffhanger for Cinder, again, well, it wasn't, again, okay, I don't know if it was technically a cliffhanger because Dr. Erlon gave her the foot, and I think he gave her a new hand and told her basically how to escape. Cinder's like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to escape. And then Levana will just be looking for a phantom. So you could end it right there and just kind of, okay, you know, yes, there's some unresolved stuff, but it ended with Cinder escaping. But then it just like, oh, it just is so good. I love this book so much. There was a point, I don't have this many anymore, but there was a point where I literally had 5 copies of Cinder. I had Cinder, the like paperback original version that I first bought. I had the same edition but hardcover. Then I had the paperback new covers that I got for my birthday. I had the hardcover Cinder collector's item, and then I had the Cinder Fairy Loot edition. I sold a handful of those just because I had too many and I wasn't reading most of them. Literally the only ones I read are the paperback ones that are so worn and beloved that I can't not read those. This is definitely my top fiction book. Like, it really is just so good. I know I mentioned this earlier. I used Cinder, the book. I know I mentioned this earlier. I used this book as a template. I literally put sticky notes in the book and I was like, okay, here's the inciting event, here's the midpoint, here's the this, here's the that, so that I could help with my own writing, get a visual of, okay, so every so many pages, you have to have something else. You got to introduce something else to keep this ball rolling. It was just so, so good. Thank you guys so much for watching. Next week, we're going to be talking about Scarlet. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss an episode.